Imagine you are an elite, hardened, organized crime figure. You've built this massive reputation on intimidation, you've made millions of pounds operating in the shadows, and, well, you genuinely believe you are the smartest person in any room you walk into.
Right.
And then, out of nowhere, you lose it all to a 27-year-old financial advisor who completely scams you out of your own dirty money.
Oh, man.
What happens when the criminal underworld gets conned by a millennial with a taste for crystal champagne?
I mean, it creates a collision of two very different worlds.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have this white-collar financial fraud like just slamming headfirst into street-level visceral violence. And as we're going to see today, the fallout from that collision is absolutely devastating.
It is the absolute definition of a debt paid in blood. I mean, on the surface, she's this 27-year-old financial advisor working in Glasgow.
Yeah.
But behind the curtain, her business model was essentially a massive game of financial musical chairs.
That's exactly what it was.
Except she was the only one taking the money and removing the seats. Eventually, a ball was going to drop, and the sharks were waiting.
Yeah, she wasn't just offering bad investment advice. She was deeply embedded in active, multi-layered fraudulent schemes.
And she was funding a tremendously lavish lifestyle with it, right?
Oh, totally. The sources mention her casually dropping like 150 pounds on bottles of crystal champagne. To maintain that illusion of extreme wealth, she was essentially taking money directly from her clients and just funneling it into her own pockets to keep the charade going.
Wow. And, the sheer scale of the scams is staggering.
Yeah.
In one major instance, she targeted the Glasgow Chinese community.
Yeah, that was a big one.
She pocketed 175,000 pounds in deposits from 30 different people. These were individuals who thought they were putting down hard-earned money to reserve flats at a new development called Lockport Gate in Maryhill.
But she never passed a single penny to the developers.
Exactly. There were no reservation fees paid. She just fabricated the pipeline and kept the cash. She was also widely known for forging documents to help people secure mortgages they had absolutely no business getting.
Yeah.
Basically, falsifying income statements so people could buy properties way out of their league.
Which is a highly risky endeavor. When you are a facilitator for people operating outside the lines of traditional banking, you inevitably bring yourself into contact with dangerous individuals.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and when regular banks and honest clients eventually catch on and stop taking your calls, well, you still need massive injections of cash to keep your lifestyle afloat.
Yeah.
That forces you to seek out dirtier money. And that dynamic introduces us to Colin Coates.
Now, Colin Coates is such a paradox to me. This is a guy who, on paper, is highly intelligent.
Very much so.
He was a former IT specialist. He'd worked for the Civil Aviation Authority, helping develop complex air traffic control systems. He even designed high-tech trading floors for investment banks. He told the court that in a bad year, he was legitimately making 200,000 pounds. So he clearly understands complex systems and finance.
He does, but there is a very dark underbelly to Coates. Alongside that legitimate technical brilliance, he had a well-documented love for cocaine, a history of explosive violence, including a conviction for air rage, and a deep entrenchment in organized crime.
Wow.
Yeah, he was a man who used physical intimidation as a primary business tactic.
Which makes the inciting incident of this whole tragedy completely baffling.
Oh.
Lynda approached Coates and promised him a £3.2 million return on an £85,000 investment.
A massive return.
Yeah. And the mechanism she pitched to do this involved using fake Danish bearer bonds to avoid paying VAT. Now, I just have to ask, how does a supposedly brilliant IT and finance guy fall for something like that?
Well, it helps to understand how a bearer bond actually works. Most financial bonds are registered to an owner, right? There's a digital or paper trail tying the asset to your name.
Right, like normal stocks.
Exactly. But a bearer bond is literally owned by whoever is physically holding the piece of paper, just like cash. It is completely untraceable.
Oh, I see.
So Lynda essentially pitches this to Coates. She says, if we move your money into Danish bearer bonds, there is zero paper trail, meaning the tax man can't charge you value-added tax. It sounds sophisticated, it sounds international, and most importantly to a criminal, it sounds invisible.
So she uses all this financial jargon to blind him to the fact that it's a total phantom investment.
Precisely.
Still, when it all falls apart, his reaction seems to go way beyond just wanting his 85,000 pounds back.
What's fascinating here is the psychology of Colin Coates. You really have to look past the money. Yes, he thought he was getting a massive return term, but when the scam collapsed, he wasn't just angry about the lost funds.
He was embarrassed.
He lost face. For a man of his ego, a man who prides himself on being the absolute smartest guy in the room, being outsmarted and humiliated by a 27-year-old woman was an intolerable, deeply narcissistic injury. It triggered a disproportionate, obsessively violent need for revenge.
And Coates wasn't even the only shark circling her at this point. The sources detail a company director named John Glenn who had been terrorizing Lynda via text message for 5 months over a separate £180,000 debt.
Yes.
The day before she vanished, Glenn literally texted her a threat to chop her fingers off if she didn't pay up. The musical chairs had finally stopped, and she had nowhere to sit.
And the resulting violence was methodical and horrifying.
On April 14, 2011, Lynda is snatched off the street in Broomhill in Glasgow's West End. She is forced into a car by Colin Coates and his right-hand man, Phil Wade.
And Wade was a self-confessed drug dealer and debt enforcer.
Right, they drive her to a remote attic flat in West Kilbride, Ayrshire.
The preparation they put into this abduction shows it wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment crime of passion. It was highly calculated. Wade actually brought a tool bag with him, which the court later grimly referred to as a torture kit.
God, that's jelly.
It contained garden loppers, surgical tape, and vinyl gloves. They took her up to the attic, taped her to a heavy leather chair by her arms and waist, and placed sunglasses on her face where the lenses had been completely covered in tape.
Blinding her and completely disorienting her.
Exactly.
And for up to 14 days, she was not allowed to leave that chair. She was forced to sit in her own waste. Coates and Wade would arrive daily to systematically assault her, trying to extract financial information.
They wanted to know exactly where Coates' money went.
They burned her with an iron, they hit her with golf clubs, they crushed her toes. And in a detail that is just sickeningly tied to the text message she received from John Glenn, they actually used those garden loppers to sever her thumb and her little finger.
It's awful. And while Coates and Wade were the primary tormentors orchestrating this, they didn't actually stay in the flat around the clock.
Right, they hired people.
Yeah, they paid 2 small-time crooks, David Parker and Paul Smith, £10,000 to guard Lynda between these horrific torture sessions. The media often referred to these two as the babysitters.
I really need to push back on that term, babysitters. It sounds almost passive.
I agree.
Just put yourself in that flat for a second. Imagine the sheer moral bankruptcy required for 2 regular guys to just sit in an adjacent room listening to a woman being systematically tortured day after day.
Yeah.
Parker actually testified that he walked in and told Lynda, tell these guys what they want to know and get it finished.
Yeah.
He essentially told her to comply with her torturers rather than doing the basic human thing and calling the police. How does a person justify that to themselves?
It speaks to the terrifying power dynamic that organized crime figures wield. Coates and Wade were so dominant, so violently unpredictable that they created a microcosm of absolute control in that attic.
Right.
Parker and Smith claimed they were far too terrified of Coates to intervene or let her go. It highlights how criminal enterprises rely entirely on complicity manufactured through fear. They make the cost of basic human decency feel like a literal death sentence for anyone who steps out of line.
Lynda was finally murdered around April 28th. A fellow inmate of Coates, Peter Hadley, later testified that Coates bragged to him about exactly how he did it. He claimed he held her nose until she suffocated, cut off her head, and disposed of her body in a furnace.
And what follows the murder is just a masterclass in criminal arrogance.
Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly completely surreal. Remember, Colin Coates is this supposed IT mastermind, right?
Supposedly.
He orchestrates this highly complex abduction, avoids detection for 2 weeks, and yet his behavior afterward is incredibly sloppy. He actually meets John Glenn, the guy who had been texting the finger-chopping threats to Lynda at a shopping center in Broomhill.
In public?
In public, Coates casually pulls out a plastic supermarket bag, opens it right there in the mall, and shows Glenn Lynda's severed thumb, saying, "We've got her."
He was treating a piece of a human being like a morbid trophy. He also openly confessed to Lynda's former business partner, Tony Kelly, telling him that he killed her and referring to her as seafood.
Which heavily implies he dumped her remains in the water.
Right. And when John Glenn later asked Coates if he could get a financial valuation from Lynda, Coates chillingly replied that to get that, he'd need to organize a seance.
It's pure, unfiltered hubris. Eventually, they realize they need to cover their tracks, so they attempt this massive cleanup of the attic. They rip up the floorboards, they burn the leather chair.
But they left a trail.
Yeah, during the trial, a telecommunications analyst named Dominic Kirsten used cell site data to map their movements. He placed Coates and Wade's phones in West Kilbride during the captivity and, crucially, at a B&Q DIY store in Paisley on May 25 to buy cleanup supplies like paint and nails.
But despite the industrial-level cleanup, they made a critical forensic slip. Investigators found a single spot of Lynda's blood on the bathroom floor and Colin Coates' fingerprint on a door handle.
I cannot wrap my head around that fingerprint. Coates plans this for weeks. He buys a literal torture kit, he wears vinyl gloves, and then he just forgets to wipe a door handle on his way out.
It defies logic until you look at behavioral profiling. This is the ultimate manifestation of the God complex we discussed earlier.
Ooh, interesting.
Criminals of Coates' profile genuinely believe they're playing four-dimensional chess while law enforcement is playing checkers. They get so caught up in the grand design of their crime and the thrill of intimidating their peers that they completely neglect basic scene hygiene. They believe they're untouchable, treating their horrific crimes as inside jokes.
But the reality of forensic science usually catches up with hubris.
Always.
And speaking of law enforcement catching up, this brings us to a part of the story that is just infuriating. Because while Lynda was strapped to that chair in West Kilbride, there was a massive, fatal intelligence failure happening behind the scenes. We have to talk about Lynda's secret life.
Yes, the revelation that she wasn't just a fraudster, she was a police informant.
Weeks before she was murdered on March 11, Lynda was approached at Glasgow Airport by officers from the Scottish Crime and Drug Enforcement Agency, or the SCDEA.
Scotland's elite organized crime unit.
Exactly. She had agreed to inform on an Albanian drug dealer named Sokol Zafaj, who she actually claimed to be married to, along with 3 other men.
The timeline here is the critical piece of the puzzle. She was officially authorized as a covert human intelligence source, what they call a CHIS, on April 14th.
That is the exact same day she was abducted off the street by Coates and Wade.
Yes.
I just have to express my absolute disbelief here on behalf of anyone listening to this. How can a woman be an authorized, legally protected intelligence asset for an elite police unit, vanish on the exact day her deal is finalized, and the local cops investigating her disappearance aren't even told?
It's shocking. The court heard that her SCDEA handler knew she was missing within 48 hours.
But they didn't share it.
No, they did not share that crucial piece of information with the Strathclyde police officers who were actually out on the street looking for her. This raises an important question about the deeply siloed nature of law enforcement agencies.
How does something like that get justified?
Well, to understand this failure, you really have to look at how intelligence units operate. To the SCDEA, an informant operating inside an Albanian drug cartel is the holy grail. If they share Lynda's identity with local beat cops or missing persons detectives, they risk a leak. A leak means their asset is dead, and months, maybe years, of undercover work are destroyed. So they build massive, impenetrable walls around their data, operating on a strict need-to-know basis.
But taking need-to-know to that extreme is what killed her. Now, Police Scotland later stated there was no evidence that her informant status was the motive for her murder. It seems Coates and Wade killed her strictly over the 85,000 pounds, completely unaware of the Albanian drug connection.
But that entirely misses the point of why this failure matters.
Right.
The tragic irony here is that the very walls built to protect Lynda's cover are exactly what prevented local police from saving her life. The failure to share that intelligence cost local investigators vital time. Those were days where Lynda was still alive, strapped to a chair in Ayrshire.
Yeah.
If the local police had known they were looking for an active intelligence asset involved with international drug cartels, the resources, the manpower, and the urgency deployed in those crucial first 48 hours would have been entirely different.
It is a catastrophic institutional failure. It eventually led to calls for a formal inquiry by MSP Lewis MacDonald regarding how police manage informants across the board. But for Lynda, all of that was too late.
Way too late.
The trial finally took place in 2013. It was a massive undertaking. It lasted 11 weeks, and the investigation cost the public nearly £875,000.
The sentences handed down really reflected the sheer brutality of the crime. Colin Coates received a minimum of 33 years in prison. Philip Wade received 30 years.
Wow.
These stand as some of the longest sentences ever handed down in Scottish legal history. The 2 men who guarded her, Parker and Smith, got 11 years each after turning state's evidence. The judge, Lord Pentland, noted that Coates and Wade showed zero emotion as they were sent down.
But the story doesn't end with the gavel coming down. Let's jump forward a decade to 2022 and 2023. 12 years after the murder, Colin Coates writes a letter from his cell at HMP Glenachill. He sends this letter directly to Lynda's mother, Patricia. In it, he finally confesses. He writes, "I tortured and killed her daughter." He claims he acted completely alone in the actual killing, and he tells her that he buried Lynda's body in a remote field in Dunoon, Argyll.
And the authorities took this incredibly seriously. They spent 3 months digging up a 21-acre site in Dunoon. They brought in forensic scientists, soil experts, ground-penetrating radar.
And they found absolutely nothing. Not a single trace. Coates then writes in his letter that he must have inadvertently identified the wrong field because he was relying on Google Maps from his prison cell.
The psychological impact of this on Lynda's parents, Jim and Patricia, is just unfathomable. Patricia was quoted saying she was 98% sure they were finally bringing their daughter home. She had been actively preparing funeral arrangements.
It is profound weaponized cruelty. Think about it, whether Coates was genuinely confused by a satellite map, or whether he was deliberately manipulating a grieving mother from behind bars just to exert his power one last time. Either way, it serves as a final, agonizing extension of his torture. Patricia said it plainly. Without her body, there can be no closure.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it perfectly illustrates the psychological concept of ambiguous loss. In the eyes of the state, the system worked perfectly. The investigation concluded, unprecedented sentences were handed down, and the dangerous men are locked away.
But for the family, it's different.
Very different. Mourning a body is entirely different from staring at an empty field in Dunoon. Without a body to bury, the legal victory is entirely hollow. The crime doesn't end with a prison sentence. For Jim and Patricia Spence, the absence of their daughter's remains creates a permanent, inescapable state of limbo.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive looking at the glittering, deceptive world of fake bearer bonds, complex property fraud, and 150-pound champagne. And it led us to a terrifying, blood-stained attic in Ayrshire. It showed us the devastating, unchecked consequences of ego, the mechanics of organized violence, and the shocking gaps in police communication. It really forces you to reflect on the nature of justice.
It really does.
Can a society ever truly provide justice for a victim when the very institutions meant to protect them drop the ball so catastrophically?
And it leaves us with one last thing to ponder. When a victim like Lynda Spence is so deeply entwined in criminality, fraud, and deception, it often obscures their human vulnerability. It makes it very easy for the public to distance themselves from the tragedy.
Right.
But does our system subconsciously value the safety of, perfect victims more than those who make terrible, illegal choices? And considering the SCDEA's massive failure to protect their own asset, we really have to ask, how many other informants are currently operating in the shadows right now, entirely unprotected by the agencies that recruited them?
It's a haunting thought, because at the end of the day, no matter how chaotic the ledger of Lynda Spence's life was, no one deserves to have their debts collected in a torture chamber. The balance sheet of justice in this case will forever remain unequal. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, and keep exploring the complexities hidden just beneath the headlines.